My son's girlfriend's parents showed up saying, "Your son won't take no for an answer." The doorbell rang at 10:30 on a Thursday night. I was already in my pajamas watching some crime documentary when I heard it. Through the peephole, I saw two people I vaguely recognized standing on my porch looking furious. The woman had her arms crossed tight across her chest, and the man kept checking his phone like he was timing something. I opened the door and immediately recognized them as Vanessa's parents. My son Caleb had been dating Vanessa for about 8 months now. She was a sweet 16-year-old girl with long, dark hair who came over for dinner sometimes. Her parents looked nothing like the polite people who'd shaken my hand at Caleb's last basketball game. The father, Richard, stepped forward before I could even say hello. "Your son won't take no for an answer," he said in this tight voice that sounded like he was holding back from yelling. "We told him to leave Vanessa alone and he keeps harassing her." The mother, Patricia, held up her phone showing me a screen full of text messages. There were dozens of them, maybe over 100, all from Caleb's number. I could see fragments of the messages as she scrolled. "Please just listen to me. You can't do this. I'm begging you to reconsider. Don't make this decision without me." My stomach dropped, looking at all those messages. Richard continued talking while Patricia kept her phone in my face. "Your son has called our daughter 43 times today alone." 43. "He showed up at our house twice this morning before school. He's been waiting in the parking lot after her classes. This has to stop right now or we're filing a restraining order." I felt my face getting hot with embarrassment and confusion. Caleb had always been a good kid, never got in serious trouble, made decent grades, played sports. This obsessive behavior wasn't like him at all. I asked them what happened, why Vanessa wanted space from him. Patricia's expression changed to something harder, more defensive. "That's none of your concern. What matters is your son needs to respect our daughter's boundaries and leave her alone. She doesn't want to see him anymore, and he needs to accept that." Richard added that they'd already spoken to the school counselor, and the police were aware of the situation. They were giving me one chance to handle this before they took legal action. I promised them I'd talk to Caleb immediately and make sure he stopped contacting Vanessa. They left, without another word, walking quickly back to their car. I stood in my doorway, watching their taillights disappear down the street, feeling sick to my stomach. I went upstairs and knocked on Caleb's door. He was 17, a junior in high school, and usually pretty responsible about homework and curfew. The door was locked, which was unusual. "Caleb, I need to talk to you right now. It's important." I heard movement inside, and after a long pause, the lock clicked. He opened the door, looking terrible. His eyes were red and swollen, like he'd been crying for hours. His hair was messy, and he was still in the clothes he'd worn to school that morning. The room behind him was dark, except for his desk lamp. I could see his phone on the bed, screen up, like he'd been staring at it. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "Vanessa's parents just came here. They said you've been harassing her, calling dozens of times, showing up at their house. What's going on?" Caleb's face crumpled, and he sat down hard on his bed. His hands were shaking as he picked up his phone. "Dad, I know how this looks, but you have to understand what's happening. Vanessa is pregnant." The words hit me like cold water. I sat down in his desk chair because my legs suddenly felt weak. My 17-year-old son got his 16-year-old girlfriend pregnant. "How long have you known?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Caleb wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She told me 3 days ago. She took a test, and it was positive. She was scared and crying, and I told her we'd figure it out together. We talked about all the options, keeping it or adoption or whatever she wanted to do. I said I'd support her no matter what she chose. Then the next day, she stopped answering my calls. Her parents picked her up from school, and I haven't been able to talk to her since." He showed me his phone with all the unanswered messages. I scrolled through them, reading his increasingly desperate pleas. "Please just call me back. Are you okay? Your parents can't keep us from talking. I need to know you're safe. Don't do anything without telling me." None of the messages were threatening or mean, just desperate and worried. I asked him why he thought her parents were keeping them apart. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I think they're making her get an abortion, without even letting her think about it or talk to me about it. That's why they want me to stop calling. They don't want me to have any say in what happens." My head was spinning, trying to process everything. I asked if he was sure about the pregnancy, and he nodded. She showed me 3 positive tests. She was definitely pregnant. I spent most of that night lying awake trying to figure out what to do. On one hand, Vanessa's parents had a right to help their daughter make medical decisions. On the other hand, Caleb was the father, and shouldn't he have some say in what happened? But legally, at 16, Vanessa's parents had full authority over her medical care. I kept thinking about those text messages, how desperate Caleb sounded. By morning, I decided I needed to try talking to Vanessa's parents calmly, adult to adult. I called Richard's number around 8 a.m. after Caleb left for school. He answered on the first ring, sounding immediately hostile. I told him I wasn't calling to cause problems. I just wanted to understand the situation. There was a long silence before he said in this cold voice that Vanessa was dealing with a private medical issue, and it was none of our business. I tried to explain that Caleb was worried about her, that he cared about her, and just wanted to make sure she was okay. Richard cut me off. "Your son needs to stay away from our daughter. We've already scheduled an appointment to handle this situation and we don't need his interference. Then he hung up on me. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling helpless. Handle this situation. That's how he'd phrased it, like the pregnancy was just a problem to be eliminated. That evening, Caleb came home from school looking even worse than the night before. He said Vanessa hadn't been in any of her classes. Her friends told him her parents kept her home. He'd tried to go to their house during lunch, but they wouldn't answer the door even though he could see Vanessa's car in the driveway. I'm going crazy, Dad. What if they're forcing her to do something she doesn't want? What if she wants to keep the baby but they won't let her? I tried to calm him down, told him that Vanessa's parents probably just needed time to process everything, but I could see the panic in his eyes getting worse. He pulled out his phone and showed me that he'd tried calling the local women's clinic, the Planned Parenthood, and 2 other abortion providers in the area. None of them could tell him if Vanessa had an appointment due to privacy laws. Then he showed me something else that made my blood run cold. He'd hired a private investigator. I stared at the email confirmation for a $500 retainer payment to someone named Dennis Kovach, licensed private investigator. Caleb, what did you do? He stood up, pacing his small room. I paid him to follow Vanessa's parents, to see where they take her, to find out if they're forcing her to get an abortion against her will. I told Caleb that hiring a private investigator was taking things too far, that it could be seen as stalking or harassment, but he wasn't listening to me anymore. He pulled up the investigator's preliminary report on his laptop. Dennis had been following Patricia for 2 days. The report included photos of her going to the grocery store, getting gas, going to work at her real estate office. Nothing suspicious or relevant to Vanessa's situation. But then on the second page, there were photos from that morning. Patricia's car parked outside a medical building downtown. The timestamp showed she'd been there from 9:15 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Dennis had zoomed in on the building directory visible through the glass doors. Suite 304 was listed as Women's Health Associates, Obstetrics and Gynecology. Caleb pointed at the screen. That's an abortion clinic, or at least they do abortions there. I called them yesterday, and they said they provide pregnancy options counseling and procedures. She was in there for over 2 hours, Dad. What else would she be doing there? I had to admit it looked suspicious, but 2 hours could mean a lot of things. Initial consultation, paperwork, counseling. It didn't necessarily mean Vanessa had an abortion that day. The next morning, I woke up to find Caleb's bedroom door open and his bed empty. His car was gone from the driveway. My phone showed a text from him sent at 6 a.m. Gone to talk to Vanessa's doctor. Need to know what's happening. I called him immediately, but it went to voicemail. I tried 3 more times with the same result. By 8 a.m., I was getting really worried. I called the medical building where Patricia had been spotted, asking to speak to someone at Women's Health Associates. The receptionist who answered sounded young and uncertain. She said they couldn't give out any patient information. I explained I wasn't asking about a patient. I was looking for my son who might be in their waiting room. She put me on hold for several minutes. When she came back, her voice had changed to something more serious. Sir, your son was here earlier this morning. He was asking questions about a patient and became very insistent when we couldn't help him. We had to ask him to leave. Security escorted him out. My heart sank. Is he still there? She said no. He'd left about 20 minutes ago. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately tried calling Caleb again. This time he answered. His voice sounded strange, disconnected. Dad, they wouldn't tell me anything. I just wanted to know if Vanessa was okay. I told Caleb to come home immediately so we could talk about this rationally. He showed up 30 minutes later looking defeated and exhausted. We sat in the kitchen while I made coffee. Neither of us drank. He explained that he'd gone to the medical building hoping to see Vanessa, maybe catch her before an appointment, but the building had been mostly empty at 6:30 a.m. He'd gone to the clinic's office on the 3rd floor and tried to explain the situation to the receptionist. When she refused to confirm whether Vanessa was even a patient, he'd gotten frustrated and raised his voice. That's when security came. I asked him what he was thinking, showing up at a medical office and demanding information. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. I'm thinking that my girlfriend is pregnant with my baby, and her parents are going to force her to get an abortion without even letting me talk to her about it. That baby is half mine, Dad. Don't I get any say at all? The legal reality was harsh. No, he didn't have any say. At 17, he wasn't old enough to have parental rights even if the baby was born. And Vanessa, at 16, was still under her parents' authority for medical decisions. The law didn't give him any rights in this situation. That afternoon, I got a call from the police. Officer Daniels from the local precinct explained that Richard had filed a formal complaint against Caleb for harassment. They weren't pressing charges yet, but this was an official warning. One more incident, and Caleb would be arrested. Officer Daniels asked to speak to Caleb directly. I handed over the phone and watched my son's face as the officer explained the restraining order process. When Caleb hung up, he looked broken. They're filing for a restraining order tomorrow. I won't even be allowed within 500 feet of Vanessa's house or her school. How am I supposed to go to my own school if she's there? The officer had explained that the school would work out an arrangement, probably having Caleb attend classes at different times, or possibly transferring him to another school temporarily. That night, I called my brother Leo, who was a family lawyer. I explained the whole situation while Caleb sat on the couch pretending not to listen. Leo was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said something that surprised me. You need to get Caleb a lawyer. Not me. I do estate planning. He needs someone who specializes in family law and reproductive rights. This situation could get very complicated very fast. Leo gave me the name of an attorney named Rachel Brennan who had experience with reproductive rights cases. I called her office first thing in the morning and explained the situation. She agreed to meet with us that afternoon. Her office was in a modern building downtown with glass walls and expensive-looking furniture. Rachel was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a direct manner. She listened to Caleb explain everything while taking detailed notes. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. I'm going to be honest with you. This is a difficult situation legally. You're a minor, she's a minor, and her parents have legal authority over her medical decisions. However, there are a few things we might be able to do. She explained that in some states, fathers had the right to be notified about abortion decisions, but our state wasn't one of them. She could potentially file for an emergency injunction to prevent the abortion until paternity was established and Caleb's rights were considered. But that would require proof that an abortion was imminent and would likely make the situation much worse. Rachel asked the question that had been bothering me. Do you actually know for certain that Vanessa wants an abortion? Or is this what you're assuming her parents want? Caleb admitted he didn't know for sure what Vanessa wanted. They hadn't been able to talk since she told him about the pregnancy. That's the real problem here, Rachel said. You're operating on assumptions and worst-case scenarios. For all you know, Vanessa might be planning to keep the baby, and her parents are just protective during a difficult time, or she might have already decided on adoption. You don't actually know what's happening because you haven't been able to communicate with her. She recommended that we try one more time to reach out to Vanessa's parents through a neutral third party. She offered to write a letter to them on law firm letterhead, requesting a conversation to discuss everyone's rights and concerns. Maybe if they understood that Caleb had retained counsel, they'd be more willing to talk. I agreed to let her send the letter. Caleb looked skeptical, but didn't object. The letter went out that afternoon via certified mail. 2 days passed with no response. On the third day, Rachel called to say she'd received a reply from an attorney representing Richard and Patricia. They were formally declining any communication with Caleb or his representatives. Furthermore, they were proceeding with the restraining order and demanding that Caleb delete Vanessa's number from his phone and cease all attempts at contact. The restraining order hearing was set for the following week. Rachel explained that at the hearing, the judge would hear from both sides and decide whether to grant a temporary restraining order. If granted, it would last for several weeks until a full hearing could be scheduled. We need to be prepared for Vanessa to testify that you've been harassing her, Rachel warned Caleb. Her parents have clearly coached her on what to say. You need to stay calm and let me handle the questioning. The hearing was in family court on a Monday morning. I sat in the gallery while Caleb sat at the defendant's table with Rachel. Richard, Patricia, and their attorney sat on the other side. Vanessa was there too, and seeing her made my chest tight. She looked pale and thin, wearing a loose sweater that hid her body. She wouldn't look at Caleb even though I could see him staring at her desperately. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Judge Thornton, called the hearing to order. Patricia's attorney went first, presenting the case for the restraining order. He showed the judge a printout of all the text messages, the call logs showing 43 attempts in one day, witness statements from neighbors who saw Caleb at their house multiple times. He painted a picture of an obsessive, controlling teenage boy who couldn't accept that his girlfriend wanted space. Then, Vanessa was called to testify. She walked to the stand slowly, keeping her eyes down. Her voice was barely audible as she answered the attorney's questions. Yes, Caleb had been her boyfriend. Yes, they'd broken up 3 days ago. No, she didn't want to see him anymore. Yes, his constant calling and texting made her feel scared and harassed. The attorney asked her directly, "Has Caleb threatened you or tried to control your decisions?" Vanessa hesitated for just a moment. Then she said in that same quiet voice, "He won't accept my decision about my pregnancy. He keeps trying to change my mind." The courtroom went silent. Judge Thornton leaned forward. "You're pregnant?" Vanessa nodded. Patricia's attorney jumped in quickly. "My clients are supporting their daughter through a private medical situation. The respondent has been harassing her about her healthcare choices, which is precisely why we need this restraining order." Rachel stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to question the witness." Judge Thornton nodded. Rachel approached Vanessa with a gentle expression. "Vanessa, did you and Caleb discuss the pregnancy before you stopped communicating with him?" Vanessa glanced at her parents before answering. "Yes." "And during that conversation, did Caleb threaten you or try to force you to do anything?" "No. He said it was my choice." Rachel continued. "So when did you decide you no longer wanted to communicate with Caleb?" Vanessa's voice got even quieter. "After I told my parents. They said it would be better if I didn't talk to him while I figured things out." Rachel nodded. "And have you figured things out? Do you know what decision you're making about the pregnancy?" Vanessa started crying. Patricia's attorney objected. "Your Honor, the witness's medical decisions are not relevant to whether a restraining order should be granted." Judge Thornton sustained the objection, but I could see her expression had changed. She looked at Vanessa with something like sympathy. Rachel returned to her table and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client is not harassing his former girlfriend. He's trying to communicate with her about a pregnancy that involves him too. He has a legitimate interest in understanding what's happening and ensuring that any decisions being made are truly Vanessa's choices and not being forced on her by others. Patricia's attorney stood up. That's outrageous. My clients are not forcing anything on their daughter. They're protecting her from harassment during an incredibly difficult time. Judge Thornton held up her hand for silence. She looked at Vanessa, who was still crying on the stand. Vanessa, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Are you making your own decisions about this pregnancy, or are your parents making them for you? Vanessa looked at her parents, then at Caleb, then at the judge. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Finally, she whispered something I couldn't hear from the gallery. Judge Thornton asked her to speak up. Vanessa's voice cracked as she said, I don't know what I want. The courtroom erupted. Patricia tried to stand up and her attorney pulled her back down. Richard's face had gone bright red. Judge Thornton banged her gavel. Everyone sit down and be quiet. She looked at Vanessa with concern. Would you like to speak to me privately in my chambers? Vanessa nodded, tears streaming down her face. Judge Thornton called for a 15-minute recess and asked Vanessa to come with her. She also asked both attorneys to join them, leaving the rest of us in the courtroom. I watched Caleb slump in his chair, his head in his hands. After 20 minutes, they came back out. Judge Thornton looked serious as she took her seat. After speaking with Vanessa privately, I'm denying the request for a restraining order at this time. However, I'm ordering mandatory family counseling for Vanessa and her parents, and I'm ordering that Vanessa be allowed to communicate with Caleb if she chooses to do so. Patricia stood up. Your Honor, that's not acceptable. Judge Thornton's voice turned cold. Sit down, Mrs. Whitman. This is my courtroom and my decision. I'm also ordering that no medical procedures regarding Vanessa's pregnancy take place for the next 2 weeks while she receives counseling and has time to make an informed decision without pressure from anyone. If the parents violate this order, they will be held in contempt. After the hearing, I found Caleb outside the courtroom. He was leaning against the wall, looking dazed. Rachel came out and explained what had happened in chambers. Vanessa had broken down and told the judge that her parents had already scheduled an abortion for the following day. She said she wasn't sure if she wanted it, but felt like she had no choice. Her parents had told her that keeping the baby would ruin her life, that Caleb would abandon her, that she'd end up a single mother with no future. The judge had been furious. She'd ordered the immediate counseling and the 2-week hold on any procedures. Rachel said it was unusual for a judge to intervene so directly, but Judge Thornton clearly felt that Vanessa was being coerced. On the drive home, Caleb stared out the window in silence. Finally, he said, I just want her to make her own choice. Whatever she decides, I'll support it. But it has to be her choice, not her parents forcing her. I told him I was proud of how he'd handled everything. That night, Caleb's phone rang around 9 p.m. I heard him answer, and then his voice got urgent. Vanessa, are you okay? I stayed in the hallway near his door, not quite eavesdropping, but definitely listening. Their conversation lasted almost an hour. I couldn't hear her side, but I heard him say things like, I'm not trying to control you, and whatever you decide, I promise I'll be there, and your parents can't stop you from making your own choice. The next morning at breakfast, Caleb told me what Vanessa had said. She'd called from her friend's phone because her parents took her cell away after the hearing. She told him that the abortion appointment for that Friday had been canceled by court order, but her parents were furious. They'd spent the evening telling her she was making the biggest mistake of her life by not getting the abortion immediately. Her mother had cried and said Vanessa was throwing away her future. Her father had threatened to cut her off financially if she kept the baby. But Vanessa also said something that gave Caleb hope. She said she'd been having dreams about being pregnant, about holding a baby, and in the dreams, she felt happy. She wasn't sure what that meant, but she knew she at least needed time to think without everyone pressuring her. The court-ordered counseling started 3 days later. Rachel had recommended a therapist named Dr. Nina Castellano, who specialized in crisis pregnancy counseling. The first session was just Vanessa and Dr. Castellano. The second session included Richard and Patricia. The third session, which happened a week after the hearing, included Caleb. I drove him to Dr. Castellano's office, which was in a quiet building near the park. He was nervous, bouncing his leg in the passenger seat the whole drive. What if she's decided to get the abortion? What do I say? I told him to just be honest and supportive. The waiting room was painted in calm blues and greens. Caleb checked in with the receptionist and sat down next to me. After 10 minutes, Dr. Castellano came out. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun. She shook Caleb's hand and led him back through a door. He was in there for 2 hours. When he finally came out, his eyes were red, but he looked calmer than I'd seen him in weeks. On the drive home, he told me what happened. Vanessa had been there with her parents at first. Dr. Castellano had asked everyone to share their feelings without interruption. Richard had said he was worried about Vanessa's future, that she was too young to be a mother, that this would destroy her college plans. Patricia had cried and said she just wanted to protect her daughter from making a mistake she'd regret forever. Then Vanessa spoke. She said she was tired of everyone telling her what to do, that she appreciated her parents' concern, but she needed to make her own decision. She said she'd been researching adoption and found it was a real option she hadn't considered before. She could carry the pregnancy to term and place the baby with a family who wanted children. That way, the baby would have a good life and she could continue with her education. Caleb said her parents had reacted badly to the adoption idea. Patricia had said that pregnancy would still ruin Vanessa's junior year of high school, that everyone would know and judge her. Richard had pointed out that Vanessa's body would change permanently, that labor was dangerous, that this wasn't a simple solution. But Dr. Castellano had intervened. She'd asked Richard and Patricia to step out so she could talk to Vanessa and Caleb alone. Once they were gone, Vanessa had finally opened up. She'd admitted she didn't want an abortion. She'd had nightmares about it, about regretting it for the rest of her life. But she also knew she wasn't ready to be a parent at 16. Adoption seemed like the best option, but her parents were so against continuing the pregnancy at all that she felt trapped. Dr. Castellano had asked Caleb what he wanted. He'd told Vanessa the same thing he'd been saying all along, that he'd support whatever decision she made. If she wanted to parent the baby together, he'd figure out how to make it work. If she wanted adoption, he'd help her find a good family. If she ultimately decided on abortion, he wouldn't fight her even though it would hurt. The important thing was that it was her genuine choice. Vanessa had cried and said she wished her parents could be that supportive. At the end of the session, Dr. Castellano had called Richard and Patricia back in. She'd told them directly that Vanessa was leaning toward adoption and that as her parents, they needed to support her decision even if they disagreed with it. She'd also said that trying to force an abortion on a teenager who didn't want one could cause serious psychological trauma. Richard had argued that adoption was just as traumatic, forcing Vanessa to go through pregnancy and labor only to give up a baby. But Dr. Castellano had been firm. The research shows that women who have abortions they don't want suffer more psychological harm than women who choose adoption, even when adoption is difficult. Vanessa is being clear about what she feels she can handle. You need to listen to her. The session had ended with an agreement to meet again in 3 days. Over the following week, I watched Caleb transform. He started researching adoption agencies and open adoption arrangements. He printed out information packets and shared them with Vanessa through email since her parents still had her phone. He found stories from birth mothers who'd chosen adoption and felt good about their decision years later. He was trying so hard to support her without pushing his own agenda. I was genuinely proud of him for growing up so much in such a short time. The second counseling session with everyone together was apparently more positive. Dr. Castellano reported to the judge that Vanessa was now clear about wanting to pursue adoption. Richard and Patricia were still resistant, but had agreed to at least discuss it as an option. Dr. Castellano recommended continuing counseling throughout Vanessa's decision-making process. The judge extended her order prohibiting any abortion procedures for another 2 weeks and scheduled a follow-up hearing. During this time, I got a call that changed everything. It was from Richard. His voice was different, less hostile, almost broken. He asked if we could meet to talk, just the two of us. I agreed and we met at a coffee shop near downtown. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years. He ordered coffee he didn't drink and sat across from me in silence for a while. Finally, he said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to keep it confidential until I figure out how to handle it." My stomach dropped. He continued, "Patricia and I got Vanessa's medical records from her first OB appointment, the one she went to when she first found out she was pregnant. The records show that Vanessa is actually 9 weeks pregnant, not 6 weeks like she told everyone. I did the math in my head. 9 weeks ago would have been before Vanessa and Caleb started dating. They'd only been together for 8 months, but they hadn't become intimate until a few weeks into their relationship." I asked Richard what he was saying. Richard's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and showed me photos of medical documents. The ultrasound report clearly stated gestational age of 9 weeks 2 days based on fetal measurements. The date of the ultrasound was 2 weeks ago. I stared at the numbers trying to make them make sense. Richard said, "Caleb isn't the father. Vanessa got pregnant before she started dating him. I think she knew she was pregnant and started dating Caleb to have someone to blame it on. The accusation made me angry at first. I started to defend Caleb, to say Vanessa wouldn't do that, but Richard cut me off. I know how this sounds, but think about it. Vanessa told Caleb she was pregnant within a few weeks of them becoming intimate. How did she know so fast? Because she was already pregnant and was waiting for the right time to tell him. My mind was racing. If this was true, it meant Caleb had been putting himself through hell for a pregnancy that wasn't even his. It meant all the harassment accusations, the restraining order hearing, the desperate attempts to contact Vanessa had been for someone else's baby. I asked Richard who the real father was. He shook his head. Vanessa won't tell us. She insists it's Caleb's even when we show her the medical evidence. Patricia and I have been going crazy trying to figure out who it could have been. I felt sick. Does Caleb know about this? Richard said no. That's why he'd wanted to meet with me first. He wanted to know how I thought we should handle it. Part of him wanted to tell Caleb immediately, to let him off the hook for a responsibility that wasn't his. But another part worried about what it would do to Vanessa if everyone knew she'd been lying. I asked the question that had to be asked. "Richard, do you know who the father is? Do you suspect anyone?" Richard's face did something complicated. Then he said very quietly, I think it might be Patricia's brother. My uncle. He lives with us. Has been staying in our guest room for about 6 months. I felt my blood turn cold. You think your brother-in-law got your 16-year-old daughter pregnant? Richard nodded, his eyes filling with tears. He's 42. He's always been too friendly with Vanessa. Too interested in her life, her friends, what she does. Patricia always said I was paranoid, that he was just being a good uncle. But now, with the timeline, he trailed off. I asked if he'd confronted this uncle. Richard said he'd asked him directly, and the uncle had denied it completely. Said Richard was crazy for even suggesting such a thing. But the uncle had moved out the next day, saying he needed space from the accusation. I told Richard that if he believed his daughter had been abused by an adult family member, he needed to call the police immediately. This wasn't about pregnancy anymore. This was about a potential crime. Richard looked defeated. Patricia won't let me. She says I'm wrong, that I'm ruining her brother's life with false accusations. She says the father is probably some boy from school that Vanessa hooked up with at a party. She thinks Vanessa is just confused about dates, but I know my daughter. She's not confused. She's protecting someone. We sat there in that coffee shop for another hour while Richard told me everything he suspected. The uncle, whose name was Gerald, had started living with them after losing his job in construction. He'd been unemployed and depressed. Vanessa had been sympathetic to him, spending time talking to him after school. Richard had thought it was sweet that she was being kind to someone going through a hard time. Now he wondered if Gerald had taken advantage of that kindness. Richard had looked through Vanessa's room after Gerald moved out and found a bracelet he'd never seen before. An expensive silver bracelet with Vanessa's name engraved on it. When he asked Vanessa where it came from, she said a friend gave it to her. But Richard had found the receipt in Gerald's nightstand drawer. He'd bought it 6 weeks before Vanessa got pregnant. I didn't know what to tell Richard. This was so far beyond the situation I'd thought we were dealing with. I'd assumed this was about teenage pregnancy and parental control. Now it seemed like it might be about abuse and cover-up. I asked Richard what he wanted me to do with this information. He said he needed help convincing Patricia to take this seriously. He thought if another parent backed up his concerns, Patricia might listen. He also wanted to know if I'd support a DNA test to prove Caleb wasn't the father before Vanessa made any permanent decisions about the pregnancy. I agreed to both. The next step was telling Caleb. I went home and asked him to sit down. He could tell something was wrong by my expression. I explained everything Richard had told me. The gestational age, the timeline that didn't match, the possibility that Vanessa had lied about him being the father. Caleb's face went white. He kept shaking his head. No, that's not possible. We were together. She told me I was the first. But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. I asked him to think carefully about the timeline. When exactly had they first been intimate? He counted back on his fingers. 7 weeks ago. Maybe 8 at the most. The medical records said 9 weeks pregnant as of 2 weeks ago. That would mean conception happened 11 weeks ago. He definitely wasn't the father. Caleb stood up and started pacing. Why would she lie to me? Why would she let me think it was mine? Why would she put me through all of this? I didn't have answers. Maybe she was scared and needed someone to lean on. Maybe she was protecting the real father. Maybe, and this was the darkest possibility, maybe she didn't want to admit what had really happened to her. I told Caleb about Richard's suspicion regarding the uncle. Caleb stopped pacing. He said, Gerald, the guy who lived with them? He was always around when I picked Vanessa up, always asking where we were going, when I'd bring her home. I thought he was just being protective. Oh my God. We sat in silence for a while. Finally, Caleb said he needed to talk to Vanessa. He needed to hear from her what the truth was. I told him to be careful, that if she'd been abused by an adult, confronting her might make things worse. But Caleb was determined. He texted Vanessa from my phone since she wouldn't respond to his number. He asked her to meet him at the park. To his surprise, she agreed. I drove him there and waited in the parking lot while they talked on a bench near the pond. Through the car window, I could see their body language. Vanessa was hunched over, defensive. Caleb was leaning forward, talking urgently. At one point, Vanessa stood up like she was going to leave. Caleb gently touched her arm, and she sat back down. They talked for over an hour. When Caleb came back to the car, his eyes were red. He got in and sat in silence for a few minutes before he could speak. She admitted it. I'm not the father. I asked who was. Caleb's voice was hollow. She won't tell me. She just kept saying it doesn't matter, that the baby is hers, and she'll decide what to do with it. I asked her directly if someone hurt her, if someone forced her. She said no, but she was lying. I could tell she was lying. We drove home in silence. That night, I called Rachel and explained the new developments. She listened carefully and then said something I hadn't considered. If Vanessa is protecting someone who abused her, and that person is still out there, she might be in danger. We need to involve the authorities. I told her about Richard's suspicions regarding Gerald, but also about Patricia's resistance to believing it. Rachel said she'd file a report with Child Protective Services. They would be required to investigate if there was suspicion of abuse. The next day, a CPS investigator named Monica showed up at Richard and Patricia's house. Richard had called to warn me. He said Patricia was furious, accusing him of calling CPS himself. He'd told her he didn't, but she didn't believe him. Monica interviewed Vanessa privately for 2 hours. Afterwards, she interviewed Patricia and Richard separately. According to Richard, who called me after Monica left, Vanessa had stuck to her story. She insisted she'd been in a consensual relationship with Caleb, and the pregnancy was his. She denied any abuse or coercion. Monica had asked about Gerald, and Vanessa said he was just her uncle who'd lived with them for a while. She said he'd never touched her inappropriately or made her uncomfortable. Patricia had backed up Vanessa's story completely. She'd told Monica that Richard was having paranoid delusions about her brother and that his accusations were tearing their family apart. Richard had told Monica everything he suspected, but without any direct evidence or an admission from Vanessa, there wasn't much CPS could do. Monica had said she'd keep the case open and would follow up in a week. That same afternoon, I got a call from Detective Wallace from the police department. He said he'd been contacted by CPS about potential abuse and wanted to ask some questions. Could he come by to talk to Caleb? I agreed, and an hour later, Detective Wallace was sitting in our living room. He was in his 50s with graying hair and a calm demeanor that probably made people trust him. He explained to Caleb that they were investigating a report about Vanessa and needed to understand the full timeline of their relationship. Caleb went through everything again. When they started dating, when they first became intimate, when Vanessa told him about the pregnancy. Detective Wallace asked if Caleb had ever met Gerald. Caleb said yes, multiple times. Gerald was always around when Caleb picked up Vanessa, always seemed interested in what they were doing, where they were going. Detective Wallace asked if Caleb had ever noticed anything inappropriate between Gerald and Vanessa. Caleb thought hard. Then he said, "Actually, yeah. One time I came to pick her up early, and Gerald answered the door. He said Vanessa was still getting ready upstairs and invited me to wait in the living room. But I heard Vanessa call down, asking who was at the door. When Gerald said it was me, she came running downstairs really fast, still in her pajamas. She looked scared or upset. I asked if she was okay, and she said yeah, but she practically pulled me out of the house. Said she wanted to finish getting ready at her friend's house instead. At the time, I thought maybe she was just embarrassed I'd seen her in pajamas or something. But thinking back, she seemed genuinely scared." Detective Wallace wrote all of this down. He asked if Caleb had any other observations about Gerald. Caleb mentioned that Vanessa always seemed nervous when Gerald was around. She'd get quiet and wouldn't make eye contact with him. One time, Gerald had reached out to put his hand on Vanessa's shoulder, and she'd flinched away. Gerald had laughed it off, saying Vanessa was jumpy, but Caleb remembered thinking it was weird. After Detective Wallace left, I asked Caleb how he was handling all of this. He said he felt stupid for not seeing what might have been happening. If Gerald had been abusing Vanessa, Caleb had been going to that house multiple times a week and never realized. I told him that predators are good at hiding what they do, that it wasn't his fault for not knowing. The next few days were quiet. Caleb went to school but said Vanessa hadn't been there. Richard texted me that she was doing homebound instruction because the stress was affecting her health. Then on Friday afternoon, something broke. Patricia called me. Her voice was shaking. "We need to talk. All of us. Can you and Caleb come to our house tonight?" I said we'd be there at 7. When we arrived, Richard answered the door looking exhausted. Patricia was sitting on the couch with her head in her hands. Vanessa wasn't there. Richard explained she was upstairs in her room. Patricia looked up at us with red, swollen eyes. She said, "I called Gerald this morning. I needed to hear him deny it again, to confirm my brother isn't capable of what Richard has been suggesting. But this time, I asked him specific questions. I asked him about the bracelet he bought Vanessa. I asked him why he moved out so suddenly. I asked him if he'd ever been alone with Vanessa in a way that could have been misunderstood." Patricia's voice broke. He said too much. He tried to explain himself, and in explaining, he basically confessed. He said Vanessa had been going through a hard time with school stress. He said he'd been comforting her. He said one night they'd watched a movie together and things had gotten confused. Confused. That's the word he used. Things got confused. Richard put his arm around Patricia, even though you could tell she didn't want to be touched. She continued. I asked him how many times things had gotten confused. He said it only happened twice. Twice. My 42-year-old brother had sex twice with my 16-year-old daughter, and he called it confused. I felt sick. Caleb looked like he might throw up. Patricia said she'd confronted Vanessa after getting off the phone with Gerald. At first, Vanessa had denied everything, but when Patricia told her that Gerald had admitted to it, Vanessa had broken down. She'd told her mother everything. Gerald had started touching her inappropriately about 4 months ago. At first, it was just hugs that lasted too long or his hand on her lower back. Then one night, when Patricia and Richard were both working late, Gerald had come into her room and kissed her. She'd been confused and scared, but he'd told her it was natural, that she was beautiful and mature for her age. The second time had happened a week later. That's when she got pregnant. Patricia was sobbing now. She said she was a terrible mother, that she should have seen what was happening, that she should have believed Richard when he first voiced his suspicions. She said Vanessa had been terrified to tell anyone because Gerald had said no one would believe her. He'd said people would think she seduced him, that she'd get in trouble. So when Vanessa realized she was pregnant, she'd panicked and started dating Caleb to have a cover story. She'd convinced herself it could be Caleb's baby, even though the timing didn't quite work. Richard spoke up. We called Detective Wallace this afternoon. He's coming tomorrow morning to take Vanessa's formal statement. We're also getting a restraining order against Gerald. Patricia's voice was fierce through her tears. I want him arrested. I want him in prison. I don't care that he's my brother. He raped my daughter. The room was silent, except for Patricia's crying. Finally, Caleb spoke. He looked at Patricia and Richard and said, I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening. I should have protected her. Richard shook his head. You didn't know. None of us knew except him. And he knew exactly what he was doing. I asked if Vanessa was okay, if she needed anything. Patricia said Vanessa had agreed to see a therapist who specialized in sexual abuse. She was also still in counseling with Dr. Castellano about the pregnancy. The question everyone was avoiding finally came up. Richard asked Caleb directly, now that you know the baby isn't yours, do you still want to be involved in what happens? Caleb didn't hesitate. Vanessa is still my friend. If she wants my support, I'll give it. But this is completely her decision now. I have no claim to this situation anymore. Over the following week, everything moved quickly. Detective Wallace took Vanessa's statement with a victim advocate present. The details were disturbing. Gerald had been grooming her for weeks before anything physical happened. He'd told her she was special, that she was more mature than other girls her age, that they had a connection. The sexual contact had happened twice, both times when her parents were working late. After the second time, Vanessa had told Gerald it couldn't happen again. He'd agreed, but said it had to be their secret or both of them would get in trouble. When Vanessa realized she was pregnant, Gerald had given her money for an abortion and told her to handle it quietly. Instead, she'd panicked and started dating Caleb. Detective Wallace also tracked down Gerald, who had moved to his mother's house 2 towns over. When confronted with Vanessa's statement, Gerald had asked for a lawyer and refused to answer questions. But his initial phone confession to Patricia was enough for the DA to press charges. Gerald was arrested on charges of statutory rape and child endangerment. Because Vanessa was 16 and Gerald was over 40, it was automatically considered statutory rape in our state regardless of consent. The pregnancy provided physical evidence of the sexual contact. Gerald's bail was set at $50,000, which his mother couldn't afford, so he stayed in jail awaiting trial. Meanwhile, Vanessa had to decide what to do about the pregnancy. With her parents now fully supportive of whatever she chose, she was able to think clearly for the first time. She met with Dr. Castellano several more times. She researched all her options extensively. Ultimately, she decided on adoption. She said she couldn't terminate the pregnancy knowing it was part of her, but she also wasn't ready to parent. She wanted the baby to go to a family who would love and care for it. Patricia and Richard supported her decision and helped her find an adoption agency that specialized in open adoptions. Over the next few months, Vanessa selected adoptive parents, a couple in their 30s who'd been trying to have children for years. They met several times and Vanessa felt comfortable with them. They agreed to an open adoption where Vanessa could receive updates and photos as the child grew. Caleb stayed in touch with Vanessa throughout her pregnancy, but their romantic relationship was over. The trauma of everything that had happened was too much to overcome. They remained friendly, and Caleb occasionally checked in to see how she was doing. When Vanessa was 7 months pregnant, Gerald's trial began. The prosecutor had a strong case with Vanessa's testimony, the medical records proving sexual contact had occurred, and Patricia's phone recording of Gerald's partial confession. Gerald's defense attorney tried to argue that Vanessa had initiated the contact, that she'd seduced a vulnerable man who was staying with her family. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of testimony, they found Gerald guilty on both charges. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 8 years. Vanessa cried when the sentence was read, but afterward, she said she felt like she could finally breathe. The man who'd hurt her was going away for a long time. 2 months later, Vanessa gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The adoptive parents were there for the birth, and Vanessa got to hold her daughter for a few hours before saying goodbye. She said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but also felt right. She knew her daughter would have a good life with parents who desperately wanted her. In the aftermath of everything, I often thought about how close we'd come to a terrible injustice. If Richard hadn't gotten those medical records, if the timeline hadn't been checked, Caleb would have spent years believing he'd fathered a child through Vanessa. He might have taken on financial and emotional responsibility for someone else's crime. More importantly, Gerald might have never been caught. He could have continued living with the family, continued having access to Vanessa, maybe even hurt her again or hurt someone else. The whole situation had been a nightmare, but at least the truth had come out. Vanessa got therapy and slowly started rebuilding her life. She returned to school for her senior year and applied to colleges. The adoption agency sent her photos of her daughter every few months, and she said seeing the baby happy and healthy with her new family brought her peace. Caleb learned some hard lessons about relationships and trust. He'd been so focused on protecting what he thought was his child that he'd missed the signs that Vanessa was protecting herself from something much darker. He felt guilty about that for a long time, but eventually came to understand that he'd done the best he could with the information he had. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.